Chapter 9. Evolution Redux. After sleeping through 100 million centuries, we have finally opened our eyes on a sumptuous planet, sparkling with color, bountiful with life. Within decades, we must close our eyes again. Isn't it a noble, an enlightened way of spending our brief time in the sun? To work at understanding the universe and how we have come to wake up in it. This is how I answer when I am asked, as I am surprisingly often, why I bother to get up in the mornings. Richard Dawkins. A few years ago, a group of businessmen in a ritzy suburb of Chicago asked me to speak on the topic of evolution versus intelligent design. To their credit, they were intellectually curious enough to want to learn more about the supposed controversy. I laid out the evidence for evolution, and then explained why intelligent design was a religious rather than a scientific explanation of life. After the talk, a member of the audience approached me and said, "I found your evidence for evolution very convincing, but I still don't believe it." This statement encapsulates a deep and widespread ambiguity that many feel about evolutionary biology. The evidence is convincing, but they're not convinced. How can that be? Other areas of science aren't plagued by such problems. We don't doubt the existence of electrons or black holes, despite the fact that these phenomena are much further removed from everyday experience than is evolution. After all, you can see fossils in any natural history museum, and we read constantly about how bacteria and viruses are evolving resistance to drugs. So what's the problem with evolution? What's not a problem is the lack of evidence. Since you've read this far, I hope you're convinced that evolution is far more than a scientific theory. It is a scientific fact. We've looked at evidence from many areas: the fossil record, biogeography, embryology, vestigial structures, suboptimal design, and so on. All of that evidence showing, without a scintilla of doubt, that organisms have evolved. And it's not just small microevolutionary changes either. We've seen new species form, both in real time and in the fossil record, and we've found transitional forms between major groups, such as whales and land animals. We've observed natural selection in action and have every reason to think that it can produce complex organisms and features. We've also seen that evolutionary biology makes testable predictions, though not, of course, in the sense of predicting how a particular species will evolve, for that depends on a myriad of uncertain factors, such as which mutations crop up and how environments may change. But we can predict where fossils will be found. Take Darwin's prediction that human ancestors would be found in Africa. We can predict when common ancestors would appear. For example, the discovery of the fishapod Tiktaalik in 370-million-year-old rocks, described in Chapter 2. And we can predict what those ancestors should look like before we find them. One is the remarkable missing link between ants and wasps, also shown in Chapter 2. Scientists predicted that they would find fossils of marsupials in Antarctica, and they did. And we could predict that if we find an animal species in which males are brightly colored and females are not, that species will have a polygynous mating system. Every day, hundreds of observations and experiments pour into the hopper of the scientific literature. Many of them don't have much to do with evolution. They're observations about details of physiology, biochemistry, development, and so on, but many of them do. And every fact that has something to do with evolution confirms its truth. Every fossil that we find, every DNA molecule that we sequence, every organ system that we dissect supports the idea that species evolved from common ancestors. Despite innumerable possible observations that could prove evolution untrue, we don't have a single one. We don't find mammals in Precambrian rocks, humans in the same layers as dinosaurs, or any other fossils out of evolutionary order. DNA sequencing supports the evolutionary relationships of species originally deduced from the fossil record. And as natural selection predicts, we find no species with adaptations that benefit only a different species. We do find dead genes and vestigial organs, incomprehensible under the idea of special creation. Despite a million chances to be wrong, evolution always comes up right. That is as close as we can get to a scientific truth. Now, when we say that evolution is true, what we mean is that the major tenets of Darwinism have been verified. Organisms evolved. They did so gradually. Lineages split into different species from common ancestors, and natural selection is the major engine of adaptation. No serious biologist doubts these propositions. But this doesn't mean that Darwinism is scientifically exhausted with nothing left to understand. Far from it. Evolutionary biology is teeming with questions and controversies. How exactly does sexual selection work? Do females select males with good genes? How much of a role does genetic drift, as opposed to natural or sexual selection, play in the evolution of DNA sequences or the features of organisms? Which fossil hominins are on the direct line to Homo sapiens? What caused the Cambrian explosion of life, in which many new types of animals appeared within only a few million years? Critics of evolution seize upon these controversies, arguing that they show that something is wrong with the theory of evolution itself. But this is specious. There is no dissent among serious biologists about the major claims of evolutionary theory, only about the details of how evolution occurred, and about the relative roles of various evolutionary mechanisms. Far from discrediting evolution, the controversies are in fact the sign of a vibrant, thriving field. What moves science forward is ignorance, debate, and the testing of alternative theories with observations and experiments. A science without controversy is a science without progress. At this point, I could simply say, I've given the evidence and it shows that evolution is true. QED. But I'd be remiss if I did that, because, like the businessman I encountered after my lecture, many people require more than just evidence before they'll accept evolution. To these folks, evolution raises such profound questions of purpose, morality, and meaning that they just can't accept it no matter how much evidence they see. It's not that we evolved from apes that bothers them so much. It's the emotional consequences of factoring that fact. And unless we address those concerns, we won't progress in making evolution a universally acknowledged truth. As the American philosopher Michael Ruse noted, nobody lies awake worrying about gaps in the fossil record. Many people lie awake worrying about abortion and drugs and the decline of the family and gay marriage and all of the other things that are opposed to so-called moral values. Nancy Pearcey, a conservative American philosopher and advocate of intelligent design, expressed this common fear. Why does the public care so passionately about a theory of biology? Because people sense intuitively that there's much more at stake than a scientific theory. They know that when naturalistic evolution is taught in the science classroom, then a naturalistic view of ethics will be taught down the hallway, in the history classroom, the sociology classroom, the family life classroom, and in all areas of the curriculum. Pearcey argues, and many American creationists agree, that all the perceived evils of evolution come from two worldviews that are part of science: naturalism and materialism. Naturalism is the view that the only way to understand our universe is through the scientific method. Materialism is the idea that the only reality is the physical matter of the universe, and that everything else, including thoughts, will, and emotions, comes from physical laws acting on that matter. The message of evolution and all of science is one of naturalistic materialism. Darwinism tells us that, like all species, human beings arose from the working of blind, purposeless forces over eons of time. As far as we can determine, the same forces that gave rise to ferns, mushrooms, lizards, and squirrels also produced us. Now, science cannot completely exclude the possibility of supernatural explanation. It is possible, though very unlikely, that our whole world is controlled by elves. But supernatural explanations like these are simply never needed. We manage to understand the natural world just fine using reason and materialism. Furthermore, supernatural explanations always mean the end of inquiry. That's the way God wants it, end of story. Science, on the other hand, is never satisfied. Our studies of the universe will continue until humans go extinct. But Piercy's notion that these lessons of evolution will inevitably spill over into the study of ethics, history, and family life is unnecessarily alarmist. How can you derive meaning, purpose, or ethics from evolution? You can't. Evolution is simply a theory about the process and patterns of life's diversification, not a grand philosophical scheme about the meaning of life. It can't tell us what to do or how we should behave. And this is the big problem for many believers, who want to find in the story of our origins a reason for our existence and a sense of how to behave. Most of us do need meaning, purpose, and moral guidance in our lives. How do we find them if we accept that evolution is the real story of our origin? That question is outside the domain of science. But evolution can still shed some light on whether our morality is constrained by our genetics. If our bodies are the product of evolution, what about our behavior? Do we carry the psychological baggage of our millions of years on the African savanna? If so, how far can we overcome it? The beast within. A common belief about evolution is that if we recognize that we are only evolved mammals, there will be nothing to prevent us from acting like beasts. Morality will be out the window, and the law of the jungle will prevail. This is the naturalistic view of ethics that Nancy Piercy fears will pervade our schools. As the old Cole Porter song goes, "They say that bears have love affairs, and even camels. We're men and mammals. Let's misbehave." A more recent version of this notion was furnished by former Congressman Tom DeLay in 1999. Implying that the Columbine High School massacre in Colorado might have Darwinian roots, DeLay read out loud on the floor of the U.S. Congress a letter from a Texas newspaper suggesting, sarcastically, that the massacre, couldn't have been because our school systems teach the children that they are nothing but glorified apes who have evolutionized out of some primordial soup of mud. In her best-selling book, Godless, the Church of Liberalism, conservative pundit Ann Coulter is even more explicit, claiming that for liberals, evolution lets them off the hook morally. Do whatever you feel like doing. Screw your secretary. Kill grandma. Abort your defective child. Darwin says it will benefit humanity. Darwin, of course, never said anything of the sort. But does modern evolutionary biology even claim that we're genetically hardwired to behave like our supposedly beastly forebears? To many, this impression came from the evolutionist Richard Dawkins' immensely popular book, The Selfish Gene, or rather from its title. This seemed to imply that evolution makes us behave selfishly, caring only for ourselves. Who wants to live in a world like that? But the book says nothing of the kind. As Dawkins shows clearly, the selfish gene is a metaphor for how natural selection works. Genes act as if they're selfish molecules. Those that produce better adaptations act as if they're elbowing out other genes in the battle for future existence. And to be sure, selfish genes can produce selfish behaviors. But there is also a huge scientific literature on how evolution can favor genes that lead to cooperation, altruism, and even morality. Our forebears may not have been entirely beastly after all, and in any case, the jungle, with its variety of animals, many of which live in quite complex and cooperative societies, is not as lawless as the saying implies. So if our evolution as social apes has left its imprint on our brains, what sorts of human behavior might be hardwired? Dawkins himself has said that the selfish gene could equally well have been called the cooperative gene. Are we hardwired to be selfish, cooperative, or both? In recent years, a new academic discipline has arisen that tries to answer this question, interpreting human behavior in the light of evolution. Evolutionary psychology traces its origin to E.O. Wilson's book, Sociobiology, a sweeping evolutionary synthesis of animal behavior that suggested, in its last chapter, that human behavior could also have evolutionary explanations. Much of evolutionary psychology seeks to explain modern human behaviors as adaptive results of natural selection acting on our ancestors. If we take the beginning of civilization at about 4000 BC, when there were complex societies both urban and agricultural, then only 6,000 years have passed until now. This represents only 1,000th of the total time that the human lineage has been isolated from that of chimpanzees. Like icing on a cake, roughly 250 generations of civilized society lie atop 300,000 generations, during which we may have been hunter-gatherers living in small social groups. And selection would have had many eons to adapt us to such a lifestyle. Evolutionary psychologists call the physical and social environment to which we adapted during this long period the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, or EEA. Surely, as evolutionary psychologists say, we must retain many behaviors that evolved in the EEA, even if they are no longer adaptive or even maladaptive. After all, there's been relatively little time for evolutionary change since the rise of modern civilization. Indeed, all human societies seem to share a number of widely recognized human universals. Donald Brown listed dozens of such traits in his book by that name, including the use of symbolic language, in which words are abstract symbols for actions, objects, and thoughts, the division of labor between the sexes, male dominance, religious or supernatural belief, mourning for the dead, favoring relatives over non-relatives, decorative art and fashion, dance and music, gossip, body adornment, and a love of sweets. Because most of these behaviors distinguish humans from other animals, they can be seen as aspects of human nature. But we shouldn't always assume that widespread behaviors reflect genetically based adaptations. One problem is that it is all too easy to make up an evolutionary reason why many modern human behaviors should have been adaptive in the EEA. For example, art and literature might be the equivalent to the peacock's tail, with artists and writers leaving more genes because their productions appealed to women. Rape? It's a way for men who can't find mates to father offspring. Such men were then selected in the EEA for a propensity to overpower and forcibly copulate with women. Depression? No problem. It could be a way of withdrawing adaptively from stressful situations, mustering your mental resources so that you can cope with life. Or it could represent a ritualized form of social defeat, enabling you to withdraw from competition, recoup, and come back to struggle another day. Homosexuality? Even though this behavior seems the very opposite of what natural selection would foster. Genes for gay behavior, which don't get passed on, would quickly disappear from populations. One can save the day by assuming that, in the EEA, homosexual males stayed home and helped their mothers produce other offspring. In this circumstance, gayness genes could be passed on by homosexuals producing more brothers and sisters, individuals who share those genes. None of these explanations, by the way, are mine. All of them have actually appeared in the published scientific literature. There is an increasing and disturbing tendency of psychologists, biologists, and philosophers to Darwinize every aspect of human behavior, turning its study into a scientific parlor game. But imaginative reconstructions of how things might have evolved are not science. They are stories. Stephen Jay Gould satirized them as just-so stories after Kipling's eponymous book that gave delightful but fanciful explanations for various traits of animals, how the leopard got his spots, and so on. Yet we can't dismiss all behaviors as having no evolutionary basis. Surely some of them do. These include behaviors that are almost certainly adaptations because they're widely shared among animals and whose importance in survival and reproduction is obvious. Behaviors that come to mind are eating, sleeping, though we don't know yet why we need to sleep. A resting period of the brain is widespread in animals. A sex drive, parental care, and favoring relatives over non-relatives. A second category of behaviors includes those very likely to have evolved by selection, but whose adaptive significance is not quite as clear as, say, parental care. Sexual behavior is the most obvious. In parallel with many animals, human males are largely promiscuous and females choosy, this despite the socially enforced monogamy that prevails in many societies. Males are larger and stronger than females and have higher levels of testosterone, a hormone associated with aggression. In societies where reproductive success has been measured, its variation among males is invariably higher than among females. Statistical surveys of personal ads in newspapers, granted not the most rigorous form of scientific investigation, have shown that while men search for younger women with bodies suited to childbearing, women prefer somewhat older males who have wealth, status, and a willingness to invest in their relationships. All of these features make sense in light of what we know about sexual selection in animals. While this doesn't make us quite the equivalent of elephant seals, the parallels strongly imply that features of our body and behavior were molded by sexual selection. But we must again take care when extrapolating from other animals. Men might be larger not because they compete for women, but because of the evolutionary outcome of a division of labor. In the EEA, men might have hunted while women, the childbearers, took care of children and foraged for food. Note that this is still an evolutionary explanation, but one that involves natural rather than sexual selection. And it takes some mental contortions to try to explain every facet of human sexuality by evolution. In modern Western societies, for example, women adorn themselves much more elaborately than males, wearing makeup, diverse and fancy dress, and so on. This is very different from most sexually selected animals, like the birds of paradise, in which it is males who have evolved elaborate displays, body colors, and ornaments. And there is always a temptation to look at behavior in our immediate surroundings, in our society, and forget that behaviors are often variable over time and space. Being homosexual may not be the same thing in San Francisco today as it was in Athens 2,500 years ago. Few behaviors are as absolute or inflexible as language or sleeping. Nevertheless, we can be fairly confident that some aspects of sexual behavior, the universal love of fats and sweets, and our tendency to lay on fat reserves, are traits that were adaptive in our ancestors, but not necessarily today. And linguists like Noam Chomsky and Steven Pinker have argued convincingly that the use of symbolic language is likely a genetic adaptation, with aspects of syntax and grammar somehow coded in our brains. Finally, there is the very large category of behaviors, sometimes seen as adaptations, but about whose evolution we know virtually nothing. This includes many of the most interesting human universals, including moral codes, religion, and music. There is no end of theories and books about how such features may have evolved. Some modern thinkers have constructed elaborate scenarios about how our sense of morality and many moral tenets might be the products of natural selection, working on the inherited mindset of a social primate, just as language enabled the building of a complex society and culture. But in the end, these ideas come down to untested and probably untestable speculations. It's almost impossible to reconstruct how these features evolved, or even if they are evolved genetic traits, and whether they are direct adaptations or, like making fire, merely byproducts of a complex brain that evolved behavioral flexibility to take care of its body. We should be deeply suspicious of speculations that come unaccompanied by hard evidence. My own view is that conclusions about the evolution of human behavior should be based on research at least as rigorous as that used in studying non-human animals. And if you read the animal behavior journals, you'll see that this requirement sets the bar pretty high, so that many assertions about evolutionary psychology sink without a trace. There is no reason, then, to see ourselves as marionettes dancing on the strings of evolution. Yes, certain parts of our behavior may be genetically encoded, instilled by natural selection in our savanna-dwelling ancestors. But genes aren't destiny. One lesson that all geneticists know, but which doesn't seem to have permeated the consciousness of non-scientists, is that genetic does not mean unchangeable. All sorts of environmental factors can affect the expression of genes. Juvenile diabetes, for example, is a genetic disease, but its harmful effects can be largely eliminated by small doses of insulin and environmental intervention. My poor eyesight, which runs in the family, is no encumbrance thanks to glasses. Likewise, we can curtail our voracious appetites for chocolate and meat with some willpower and the help of Weight Watchers meetings. And the institution of marriage has gone a long way toward curbing the promiscuous behavior of men. The world still teems with selfishness, immorality, and injustice. But look elsewhere, and you'll also find innumerable acts of kindness and altruism. There may be elements of both behaviors that come from our evolutionary heritage, but these acts are largely matters of choice, not of genes. Giving to charity, volunteering to eradicate disease in poor countries, fighting fires at immense personal risk, none of these acts could have been instilled in us directly by evolution. And as the years pass, although horrors like ethnic cleansing in Rwanda and the Balkans are still with us, we see an increasing sense of justice sweeping through the world. In Roman times, some of the most sophisticated minds that ever existed founded an excellent afternoon's entertainment to sit down and watch humans literally fighting for their lives against each other or against wild animals. There is now no culture on the planet that would not think this barbaric. Similarly, human sacrifice was once an important part of many societies. That, too, has thankfully disappeared. In many countries, the equality of men and women is now taken for granted. Richer nations are becoming aware of their obligations to help rather than exploit poorer ones. We worry more about how we treat animals. None of this has anything to do with evolution, for the change is happening far too fast to be caused by our genes. It is clear, then, that whatever genetic heritage we have, it is not a straitjacket that traps us forever in the beastly ways of our forebears. Evolution tells us where we came from, not where we can go. And although evolution operates in a purposeless, materialistic way, that doesn't mean that our lives have no purpose. Whether through religious or secular thought, we make our own purposes, meaning, and morality. Many of us find meaning in our work, our families, and our avocations. There is solace and food for the brain in music, art, literature, and philosophy. Many scientists have found profound spiritual satisfaction in contemplating the wonders of the universe and our ability to make sense of them. Albert Einstein, often mistakenly described as conventionally religious, nevertheless saw the study of nature as a spiritual experience. The fairest thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and true science. He who knows it not, and can no longer wonder, no longer feel amazement, is as good as dead. A snuffed-out candle. It was the experience of mystery, even if mixed with fear, that engendered religion. A knowledge of the existence of something we cannot penetrate, of the manifestations of the profoundest reason and the most radiant beauty, which are only accessible to our reason in their most elementary forms. It is this knowledge and this emotion that constitute the truly religious attitude. In this sense, and in this alone, I am a deeply religious man. Enough for me the mystery of the eternity of life, and the inkling of the marvelous structure of reality, together with the single-hearted endeavor to comprehend a portion, be it ever so tiny, of the reason that manifests itself in nature. Deriving your spirituality from science also means accepting an attendant sense of humility before the universe and the likelihood that we'll never have all the answers. The physicist Richard Feynman was one of these stalwarts. I don't have to know an answer. I don't feel frightened by not knowing things, by being lost in a mysterious universe without any purpose, which is the way it really is as far as I can tell, possibly. It doesn't frighten me. But it's too much to expect everyone to feel like that, or to assume that the origin of species can supplant the Bible. Only relatively few people can find abiding consolation and sustenance in the wonders of nature. Even fewer are granted the privilege of adding to those wonders through their own research. The British novelist Ian McEwan laments the failure of science to replace conventional religion. Our secular and scientific culture has not replaced or even challenged these mutually incompatible, supernatural thought systems. Scientific method, skepticism, or rationality in general has yet to find an overarching narrative of sufficient power, simplicity, and wide appeal to compete with the old stories that give meaning to people's lives. Natural selection is a powerful, elegant, and economic explicator of life on Earth in all its diversity, and perhaps it contains the seeds of a rival creation myth that would have the added power of being true. But it awaits its inspired synthesizer, its poet, its Milton. Reason and myth remain uneasy bedfellows. I certainly make no claim to be the Milton of Darwinism, but I can at least try to dispel the misconceptions that frighten people away from evolution and from the amazing derivation of life's staggering diversity from a single, naked, replicating molecule. The biggest of these misconceptions is that accepting evolution will somehow sunder our society, wreck our morality, impel us to behave like beasts, and spawn a new generation of Hitlers and Stalins. That just won't happen. As we know from the many European countries whose residents wholly embrace evolution, yet manage to remain civilized. Evolution is neither moral nor immoral. It just is, and we make of it what we will. I have tried to show that two things we can make of it are that it's simple and it's marvelous. And far from constricting our actions, the study of evolution can liberate our minds. Human beings may be only one small twig on the vast branching tree of evolution, but we're a very special animal. As natural selection forged our brains, it opened up for us whole new worlds. We have learned how to improve our lives immeasurably over those of our ancestors, who were plagued with disease, discomfort, and a constant search for food. We can fly above the tallest mountains, dive deep below the sea, and even travel to other planets. We make symphonies, poems, and books to fulfill our aesthetic passions and emotional needs. No other species has accomplished anything remotely similar. But there is something even more wondrous. We are the one creature to whom natural selection has bequeathed a brain complex enough to comprehend the laws that govern the universe. And we should be proud that we are the only species that has figured out how we came to be.